All right, and we are live. Now, today's guest, I'm pretty excited about this. There are some people you can judge by their enemies, and I think that today's guest may be one of those. This is Jon Atack, and let's just say that Scientologists are not presidents of his fan club. How are you doing today, Jon?
I'm doing very well today, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Now, I want to start this out right. I personally think it's funny, and I'm sure you're amused by it. But when I Google your name, one of the first sites that comes up is Stand, which apparently is a Scientology site. Scientologists taking action against discrimination.
Yep.
And I find it amusing, but wow, look, you have such an honor here. Jon Atack is a dishonest deprogrammer and unsavory hate blogger who has spread lies about the Scientology religion and Scientologists for over 3 decades. Now, Jon, how did you achieve such an honor?
Well, firstly, let's make a correction. It's nearly 4 decades now. It'll be 38 years this month. When I was 19, I wandered into Scientology. I spent 9 years traveling up 25 steps of the 27 levels of their bridge to total freedom. And my situation was very unusual because I was never a live-in member, so I wasn't humiliated and abused in the way that I discovered people are in Scientology. I left passionately convinced in Scientology, a true believer, and became the center of an independent movement here in the UK. And over a period of a few weeks, people started arriving with documents for me, and particularly the research of a guy called Michael Lynn Shannon. And just a great stack of documents about Hubbard's background. He claimed to be a wounded war hero. He claimed to be a nuclear physicist. He said he'd studied with gurus in India, China, Tibet, and even Mongolia. And none of this is true. And so I found myself inundated, hundreds of people coming to me from all over the world who were, they'd given all of their money away. Their family had been ruined. Their family didn't talk to them anymore. And, tremendous upsets. And so I became involved I consulted to about 150 court cases, most of which we won. And I did about 200 media pieces. I was very active from late 83 to 96. I wrote a book, which people can buy. Here you go.
The Blue Sky book,
let's
right?
see if we can get some camera somehow. Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky, which is the fascinating history of Ron Hubbard and Scientology. I worked with Sunday Times journalist Russell Miller on a book called Barefaced Messiah, which is a great title. And he based his book on my manuscript, which hadn't been published yet. But he doubled the quantity of material in it. He's really good. He does a really good job. And eventually they sort of sued me and harassed me into the ground. That piece is one of many that they've put out. And in 96, I stopped writing about them. And then in 2013, having ignored and avoided them for all these years, I started realizing that people who'd been involved in Scientology didn't seem to recover. Or the recovery process was incredibly slow. Now, they call me a deprogrammer, which is, I don't believe you can program human beings, so I don't think you can deprogram. I did, in the early 90s, do some intervention counseling with relatively fanatical members, and had developed a way of talking to them so that they would reconsider their involvement. And
can we explore that? Sorry to interrupt, but that's something I definitely think would be helpful, especially if somebody may have a friend or something like that, because I do know that typically, from what I've learned, you don't go directly at somebody who's a hardcore believer in something. If anything, kind of the Daryl Davis style. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He is a black blues musician who's talked, I think, over 70 people out of their Klan robes and Nazis and whatever. And he has a trunk. He collects them. But I mean, he spends time, he's their friend, and he works the cognitive bias angle where obviously he's black. They don't like him. That's part of the nature.
Yeah.
But he communicates with them, becomes friends with them, doesn't attack them directly. He'll argue with them about, whatever. But then they realize that, okay, well, they hate all black people except for Daryl. Daryl's okay.
Yeah.
But that little bit right there is kind of the shredding of the cognitive dissonance. It's very hard to overcome that problem. It's like, well, why is it I hate everybody, but I don't hate Daryl? And then, well, maybe there's another Daryl. And so is that something that you do? And can you talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I went on to study in the 90s. I became interested in terrorism, and because I was seeing that the same sort of, that fanaticism, that confirmation bias, my side bias, the unwillingness to even consider evidence, all of the roots that we see around in that. I mean, more recently, I've been looking at QAnon and have friends who are counseling people who sort of have one foot still in.
And Blue Anon, by the way.
Blue Anon.
Yeah. You got nuts, nutty theories that are on the right, nutty theories that are on the left. There's plenty to go around. Yeah,
wherever you go, it's very hard to say what rational belief is, because when we look at the kind of atheist community, we have the militant atheists who want to go out and persuade, proselytize the rest of us to their belief. I by the way, I'm an agnostic. I'm way too old to have any beliefs anymore. I just can't be bothered with it. So yeah, the first thing so if you're trying to de-radicalize somebody, let's put it that way, then the first thing is to develop rapport with them. What was his surname? Daryl Davis. I must look him up. He sounds fascinating.
Yeah, he's got a TED Talk, so you can get an idea in a short period of time, and then you can keep digging further. But great work.
I would definitely check that out. You first of all have to get the person on side, and I found that with a lot of interventionists that they have this really complicated process at the start, and I just got to this point where I'd go in with somebody who was a member of the family or a friend who was close to the person and say, look, your mum or your friend thinks you've been brainwashed by a cult, and I'm here to help you explain to them the reality of the situation. So you get on side straight away. And it's true. My concern is, when I was doing this with Scientologists back in the 90s, I'd always explain that I'm not concerned to get somebody out of Scientology. I'm concerned to get them to reconsider their involvement, give them information that they will not have been given by the group itself, and let them think about it. But
that's the idea interesting. That's an interrogation technique, actually, that is very powerful. Where a single interrogator will be with somebody, a suspect, because I have a lot of body language folks and things like that. And the first thing they do is talking to the suspect. They want us to do such and such. So the interrogator puts themselves as part of the team with the individual they're interrogating. So that sounds very similar, and that's interesting that your technique is close like that.
Well, again, looking at Eric Voss, the FBI's hostage negotiator, his work.
Chris Voss, I've had him on.
Chris Voss, yes, thank you. That it runs in parallel, because this is the way we work. And so you create a rapport. You then have to demonstrate that you have authority on the subject, that you know something about it. Now, because I spent 9 years and did all of this stuff in Scientology and wrote the only history of the group, I have a lot of information. And from there, you will talk with the person about the techniques of what some people call mind control, exploitative persuasion, coercive control, brainwashing. There are so many manipulations, so many terms. But you show them the techniques used by a stage hypnotist, and how somebody can suddenly not be aware of their environment, and how we tend to focus in on things. I used to use, it's a long time since I've done this, so that there's a Canadian video which is fantastic for the lapels on the jackets and the hair, called Captive Minds, Hypnosis and Beyond. And they then get into the Moonies and some of these other groups and the techniques that are used to basically to give you a peak experience. We're seeing this in the mindfulness community. I'm very concerned about some of the groups that have latched on to this.
MLMs too.
MLMs are just absolutely dreadful. And again, I have something to do with, I've talked with people who are involved in that. And again, these groups will use techniques to heighten awe, to heighten fervor. And basically people, their feelings take over. So, one of the things that's often talked about in the field I work in is critical thinking. And people will say, well, all you've got to do is get people's critical thinking so that it's working and everything will be fine. And, when I got into Scientology at the age of 19, I could already argue the hind legs off a donkey. I knew what the method was, but it didn't protect me. You have to understand how emotionally vulnerable we are. And some of that's very simple. When I arrived in Scientology, the people I met were really friendly and really genuine. They didn't realize it was a scam. They really thought it was a world-saving series of processes, that they were going to clear the planet and everything was going to be wonderful. And so you find yourself in a friendly group, and that of itself is mighty powerful.
I found that. I've had Rick Allen Ross on and Ian Haworth on, both cult experts, and they both have expressed, and I thought it was very interesting, that your average member of, let's say, a coercive group or gets caught up in them is someone who is often very intelligent, but wants to change the world. So very activist minded, cares about people, cares about the environment, that they're far more likely to get caught up in it than your standard misanthrope, let's just say.
Yes.
He'd be like, leave me alone, I want a beer. And they'd probably grumble off. But and I think a lot of people get a misconception, because it's the whole, well, I'm not dumb enough, I'm not this, I'm not that. And I'm assuming it's like any abusive relationship. It's not like they go out on a date and one slaps the other the first night. No, these things kind of go over time, and then all of a sudden you're so far down a path. And I'm guessing with Scientology that all of your friends are Scientologists, everyone in your family is Scientology, everyone around you. So you are not leaving just the church, and they got themselves designated a church, I know, but you are actually leaving everyone and everything you've known. And that can be a crisis for anyone's identity.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a sort of honeymoon period, which is the period before you get slapped. And what I think really amazed me after 9 years of involvement and being a fairly sort of talkative, friendly person, I had no idea of the conditions that the people running Scientology were put under, the so-called Sea organization, sea as in a body of water, SEA. Because Hubbard created his own private navy in the 1960s, going around the Mediterranean, dressed them all up in sailor suits. And that's still what you meet when you go into an organization. There'll be these people, for some reason, wearing Coast Guard uniforms. In fact, that's what they are. They even wear little campaign ribbons, to say that they've successfully learned how to do their, bathe or whatever, tie knots or whatever Boy Scout thing it is they're doing. It's really quite strange. But you're separated from the world. And as you say, the vulnerability, if we look at people who belong to strange groups, then most of the pioneers of science, Isaac Newton, was a Unitarian, and could actually have been executed for that belief at that time. Galileo, despite him, we're told in our school books that this is religion versus science, he had 2 children, 2 girls, and he put them both into a convent. That's how much he disbelieved in religion. Dalton, the founder, the great chemist, was a Baptist minister. Faraday was a member of a group called the Sandemanians. And as you get into the 20th century with the great nuclear physicists like Niels Bohr or Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Einstein, had pretty strange beliefs. So what tends to happen is that the greater your intelligence, the more you'll buttress up your stupidity with it. The more you'll use it to find justifications for strange behaviors. I knew 2 NASA PhD physicists in Scientology. I knew 8 medical doctors in the UK. So it really isn't a matter of, your susceptibility is not to do with your critical thinking, though we should develop critical thinking as best we can, and recognize logical fallacies and this sort of thing.
Well, that's like the fallacy. It's like you can get so deep into that they even have a fallacy for that, where it's like, okay, well, sometimes is. Like I can go and say, well, that's no true Scotsman. Oh, that's a slippery slope fallacy. Oh, and I could throw them out just as anything. That's an appeal to authority. It's like, well, yes, it's an appeal to authority, but if my gallbladder is going crazy, like my wife, I'm going to go talk to the doctor, and I might appeal to his authority. So there is a balance there, I think, and maybe that's where critical thinking or whatever can go wrong. It's like you've developed so deep into a language that you're caught in a loop.
Yeah, and I mean, in its extreme, we'd be looking at something like Boolean logic and the idea that everything that human beings do can be reduced to numbers, and it's not true. It's just that simple. We
have to ask a question.
I'm sorry?
You believe in free will?
Well, I do. I'm not sure why we use the word free, because if it's a will, it's a will. But let's put that aside. If you have will, you have a will to do something. What I tend to think is that we're born with very little of it, and we can probably achieve free will. And I am familiar with various arguments about the hard problem of consciousness and how nothing can, everything must be predetermined somehow, which to me is very much the Hindu Buddhist notion of karma, that those 419 people, somehow the lords of karma had determined they would get on that plane on the same day. And once you accept that, once the first act has occurred in the universe, everything else must unpack in a certain way, I think you're kind of trapped. And so, no, I do believe that we are responsible for our actions, which is part of the free will argument. I also believe there are mitigating circumstances as to the kind of influence that may have been put upon us. So you have situationists who believe that everything we do is because of, the situation in which the environment in which we find ourselves.
Sure, which to a degree is
to a degree.
Nurture is true. I think, I was just curious your thought on that, because that kind of gets into that whole hardcore atheist side. Most of those don't believe in free will, which is interesting from what I've seen. Okay,
but they can't help themselves, can they? They have to believe that, so.
Well, to me, you start to become a religion again if you get too far in any direction. So that's
you're into
my
predestination, and it takes away from responsibility, and I think we have to give agency and say, we as human beings, we do something, we should pay the penalty. We can mitigate it by saying, there was a gun to my head, that one's quite a reasonable mitigation.
Sure.
And under contract law, of course, if you sign a contract when you're drunk or stoned, it's not a valid contract. If you sign a contract when you're threatened, it's not a valid contract. And they're also, you have to get something in return for what you're giving, a consideration, as they say in law. So yeah, they're very important. They're foundational questions for us all to arrive at our own conclusions. But
it's nuanced. Everything has nuance.
Exactly. And so, I mean, there's a concept that there are academics who are hired by authoritarian cult groups to justify their existence and say they're doing the right thing. And they will say, well, there's no such thing as brainwashing. And they'll get into the, nobody's turned into a zombie. And I agree that I didn't meet any.
Well, there's a couple drugs out there, though, that at least during the period of the high or whatever, during the drug effects, there's some very scary things. There's a couple zombie drugs out there that really do it, at least while the drug is administered. And you can ask the CIA and MK Ultra, and I know that's conspiracy, but there's conspiracy and then there's facts. The MK Ultra program was real. They did do this stuff. It's public record.
they use the drug BZ, which completely disables people. As you say, it's a period of time, and you can see people cowed into complete subservience and being obedient as a consequence of the pressure that's put upon them. And you will find that to some extent in Scientology. You get an effect where people are being pushed into working a 90-hour week. They're only sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night.
Malnourished would help too.
Malnourished with a high carb diet. That agency diminishes, but it doesn't diminish to zero. There was an idea in the 50s called menticide, a guy called Just Mayalu, who put forward this, and menticide means the killing of the mind. So he went a stage further than the idea of brainwashing to the idea that you could
brain destroying.
Now, I've known more than 1,000 people who are involved in Scientology over the years, and I've not seen anybody whose mind was killed, save for a couple of people who were put through. They do a thing called the purification rundown, where you spend 4 hours a day in a sauna and take enormous quantities of
niacin.
Yeah,
that's their anti-drug program. Scientologists are interesting on that they really don't like drug users, from what I understand, and that's the Doug Kramer I've had on, who runs a show called Dazed and Confused on YouTube, and apparently he has been through that program multiple times. Like, he lives in Hollywood and he liked drugs and he liked rock and roll, and he kept getting put in there, and he said it was just nasty. His skin was completely orange, and they were like, well, that's sweating out impurities, and it's like, no, it's a toxic reaction to what you're doing to people, which is scary.
Well, I talked with a doctor who was an absolutely convinced Scientologist. He was a Harley Street doctor here, very highly qualified. And I said to him, Hubbard is saying that you'll have LSD released within your body. And how could that be? It's water soluble. It's highly unstable. You couldn't store it in your body. He said, no, that's true. That's not possible. So I said, secondly, I think it's one of the B vitamins that's doing this. And he said, yes, it's vitamin B1 in high doses. It's like, so people are actually tripping on the thing that's meant to be, sweating this out. It was a crazy program. As ever with Hubbard, there's no real research. He'd get 1 or 2 people to do something and then say, right, this is now true. And this is the way that we have to do it.
Well, it's interesting. Anything can be dangerous. So you've heard of water intoxication?
Yeah, you also have, say, the Leah Betts case in this country, which was blamed on MDMA, on ecstasy, and the pathologist said no, she drank 7 liters of water.
Because the MDMA makes them thirsty, and it's a huge problem.
The British government, the Home Office recommendation is that you drink water if you take MDMA, if you're going to take it. And of course, it inhibits you losing water. It's only if you're dancing at a rave and sweating a lot. And so she drank the water in accordance with, government advice, and she drowned. That was I saw an interview with a pathologist who said it's very sad, but she wasn't killed by ecstasy. She was killed by water.
Wow. I had a question. When you were talking about, you were very fortunate that you didn't get
humiliated and abused.
Oh, right. Like so many. Is that part of, essentially, they've done some studies on hazing rituals, and tribes in Africa, when they come of age, they do things that I can't really describe because YouTube will get upset with me. So I have to tap dance around certain terms. But even a fraternity, a humiliation, a prank, or whatever bonds people because they've all gone through this bad treatment together. So in a weird way, would you say that being a member of the C, I guess they call it, or whatever, okay, it could be considered reinforcement through a hazing type of situation?
Yeah, and years later, I mean, I interview a variety of former members. Years later, decades later, these groups persist. Just as people who've been in the foxholes together will. They've got
basic training, sure. Yeah.
And it means they're actually resistant sometimes to recovery from the effects because they're still clinging to the, that was why in 2013 I came back, because getting rid of the concepts, they might get rid of Hubbard's words for those concepts, but they retain ideas like reincarnation or karma without, which I don't mind. People can believe what they like. I don't believe in those things, but they don't think about it. If you ask them, why do you believe in reincarnation? Then they'll say, oh, there are lots of people have said they've done it. And you go, yeah, well, give me an example of somebody speaking medieval French, from
also, yes, there was a comic who said something about that too, but I forgot how they put it, but they said, I could believe in reincarnation if they say, yeah, I remember when I was a serf and toiling in the fields. But no, nobody remembers that. They remember that they're Cleopatra or Mark Antony or some crazy ruler. It's like, wow, well, everybody just, must have really done bad things in their past, because they seem to promote themselves when they think back. And now it's like, oof, you're on a downward spiral. Pretty soon you're going to be an insect.
Yeah, any minute. Give me an earwig. I've interviewed Karen de la Carrière, who is one of the only 8 people who've reached the pinnacle of Scientology training, which is called the Class 12 Case Supervisor. And for some years, she was involved for more than 40 years. For some years, she was in charge of all of the people receiving counseling in Florida in their Clearwater base. And she said that she actually gave me numbers for how many Jesuses, how many Judases, how many Napoleons, As you say, people don't seem to remember being insignificant for some reason. And a lot of it's, even when I was involved, people they're remembering battles in other galaxies, far, far away, 100 million years ago or what have you. And I became very curious about this. People have a reasonably good memory. And I found that they didn't have good memories of, like, if I asked them what they had for breakfast 2 days ago, they couldn't tell me, but they could tell me all the lurid color of this event where they'd been in this battle with lasers or what have you in a doll body. It's a very popular thing in Scientology. And I began to suspect, and certainly in my experience of Scientology now goes back to 1974. I've not met anybody who could perform any kind of psychic feat, which they claim, of course, remote viewing and things like that. I've not met anybody who could give me an accurate past life memory that was checkable. A friend of mine for years built this idea of this town where he'd lived and where everything was, and he wrote down the details of it. And he finally took his wife there, who'd never been a believer, and found that nothing was true. And in fact, the town hadn't existed at the time that he thought he'd lived there.
Wow. Have you actually, during your time in Scientology, ever meet L. Ron Hubbard?
No, he was pretty much getting further and further into hiding, because by the time he died, there were more than 300 outstanding writs against him for criminal and civil cases. So he was in deep hiding.
No,
I was invited to join his personal staff to go over the rainbow, as they put it then. And he was working on a music album, which he worked on with Chick Corea, the great Chick Corea, great Chick Corea. Yeah. And Chick, for a couple of years, was toing and froing, putting this terrible album called The Road to Freedom. Hubbard actually sings on it, there's a song called Thank You for Listening, which is well worth a spin to see just how crazy the man was. But I'm a drummer, so I was asked to go and play drums in Ron Hubbard's band. And at first I said, yeah, I'll come and do that for a year. And they came back and said, you need to sign a 1 billion-year contract, and that seemed a little bit, maybe 10 million years would be okay. But
yeah, give or take a couple million. Yeah, sure. Why not? How about any other notorious characters like David Miscavige? Did you ever come across him directly or no?
I met his brother, Ronnie, his older brother, who was delightful. I met him not long after I got in Scientology, and I've interviewed their late father, Ron Miscavige, who again was a really friendly and sweet man. But he said during the interview that everything had been fine with his son until 1993, and you're going, not really. You know, he was, you know, he is an incredibly aggressive man. Indeed, it was one of the things he said when I first heard of him in 1983, the year I left. He'd said that they were now tough and ruthless. Now, tough, or rough and toothless, if you want the Spoonerism of it. But I don't mind tough. Tough's okay, but ruthless, having no mercy, doesn't strike me as a religious attitude, really. And I started to really worry about. There was you then find out about what's called a severe reality adjustment. I employed a guy who'd been worked closely with Hubbard and for Hubbard, had set up organizations for him. And one day we were running an arts agency, and my wife that week hadn't sold anything. And he took her into a little room and screamed his head off at her. And I kind of, about she was suppressive and she was trying to destroy me. And I sort of hovered outside the door. I thought, this is one of the most highly trained Scientologists in the world. He must know what he's doing. And the next time I saw him 3 days later, I sat him down and said, because in Scientology, you've got this policy, if it isn't written, it isn't true. So I said, where did Hubbard write that you do this thing? And he said he didn't. I said, well, why did you do it? And he started crying. And he said, he did it to us. And he'd come within 2 inches of your face with his foul breath because his teeth rotted in his head because he was terrified of doctors and dentists, and tell you that you were worthless scum, basically. And that can certainly move people towards being zombies. That kind of vicious, raging treatment. And when I found out about that again, that started to distance me, because I come from Buddhism, and so serenity and calm is considered the noble thing. Shouting at people and bullying them, it doesn't come into it for me. It's not something I like to do, and it's not something I think is valuable, except in emergency circumstances where you need somebody to get out of the way of a bus or something. Then you can shout at them. But so finding that Hubbard was a raging maniac who, on a daily basis. I mean, we brought up the topic of drugs and how anti-drug Scientology.
Oh, apparently not him. I've heard that he imbibed very happily.
And there's no doubt. There's no doubt. There's a lecture where he says that he made himself a guinea pig on an experiment to come off phenobarbital, the very powerful barbiturate drug. And when you get to his Navy records, his Veterans Administration records, there it is. He was prescribed phenobarbital because they thought he might have an ulcer. It was never actually, the x-rays didn't show any ulceration, but he got a year's worth of barbiturates in a Navy hospital when he was supposed to be out, defeating the enemy. He was actually skiving off and stuffing himself with barbiturates. He also, in 1950, when he released his Dianetics, the mental science of modern health, as I like to think of it. Modern science of mental health, sorry about that. It actually recommends the use of amphetamines. So, and there's a passage in there where he says that alcohol is probably the most dangerous drug. And
which is true, actually. I mean, that I actually could agree with to a point. It's freely available and powerful.
Yeah, the only study I know of that's been done, which came out of Imperial College and was David Nutt, who's a professor there, published in The Lancet in 2010, very definitely says that alcohol is the most dangerous drug, both individually and socially. But so yes, that's an interesting point. What should be added to that, however, is that by the end of his life, he was most certainly an alcoholic, and he was suffering from the sort of pancreatic and liver problems that you get from taking too much alcohol.
You mentioned a lump on his head in a video too. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine and who'd worked with Hubbard, and he seemed to be getting a little bit upset about the nasty things I was saying. So I said to him, "What's the thing you most remember about Ron Hubbard?" Expecting some great tale of compassion or something. And he said the lump on his head. I later interviewed a photographer who took many of the pictures of him in Navy uniforms, and she said you'll always see that the peak of the cap is pulled down, and he basically was concealing something larger than a golf ball, more towards half a tennis ball on his head, which was a sebaceous cyst. or an acne spot that had infected. And because he wouldn't get medical help, there's even a picture of him back in about 72, 73. He had a motorcycle crash. He'd, didn't want people to see him. So he went and lived in Queens in New York. And the guy who was living with him, Jim Dincalci, took some photos, and there are a couple of them available. And you can see this huge bump on his head.
It's almost like he was becoming a monster or a demon in of himself, which is weird.
I think there was always that. And I personally, I have a friend called Yuval Law who studies fervor and belief. And he, when we first met in 2015, he gave me the criteria for temporal lobe epilepsy, the Bear-Thaddeus check sheet, which has 18 points on it. 17 of them I could tick immediately. So, for example, one of them is hypergraphia, that people with temporal lobe epilepsy will tend to have to keep writing. Now, he's listed in the Guinness Book of World Record as the most prolific writer of all time. So that one we've proved. But you also have religious, transcendent experiences, all sorts of things. It's not like a grand mal epilepsy. You don't have visible fits. In fact, on YouTube, you can find people showing you them having a temporal lobe epilepsy fit. And all you see is a nystagmus, I think it's called, a movement of the eye. But they're transported. I mean, when temporal lobe epilepsy was first being diagnosed in the 1970s, there are assertions that a lot of religious visions were probably had by people who had TLE. So I think he had that going on, and that comes from a lesion in the brain. And then
taking drugs. I'm sure that helps it along.
Well, and he just seems to be a very divided character, because he seemed to be bipolar. He would be very exuberant, which again can happen with temporal lobe epilepsy. And then in interviewing people who knew him really from 1930s onwards, there'd be these stories about him withdrawing and being depressed and having 3 or 4 days in bed where he wouldn't talk to anybody. I talked to John McMaster, who was in 1965, Hubbard declared him the world's first real clear, having for 15 years been telling people that he'd successfully got people so they were clear of their reactive mind. He finally announces this guy. And John told me that he frequently witnessed Hubbard sort of just sitting in the corner and crying, this superhuman man, and often in fits of jealousy, that as with all narcissists, he didn't like other people being praised. And he'd put John McMaster in this situation where he was getting the praise and he was better at the public speaking. And McMaster ended up being, Hubbard had this practice of throwing people off his ship, overboarding. He took photographs of it and published them. There's no doubt he was doing it.
Good Lord.
And you're thrown from it's higher than the high diving board in a swimming pool. And people who couldn't swim, you'd have your ankles tied so they could pull you back up. A really terrifying experience.
Like the worst bungee jump in the world.
Exactly, yeah. And you bang, hit the water. It's not friendly. McMaster actually broke his collarbone on the way down, and they left him in the water.
Break your neck.
Yeah, you could. I mean, one of the people I interviewed, Otto Roos, was actually keel hauled, pulled under the hull of the ship on a rope.
That's like a pirate torture, for real.
It is a pirate torture. And he was fortunate because he was a former merchant sailor. So he knew there was a rubbing strake, a steel band round the side of the ship. He'd also done judo, so he knew to bounce himself off it. It would otherwise...
That's attempted murder. I mean, I can't... Yeah. I don't know how nobody has prosecuted them. That's beyond discipline. That gets into nightmare land.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the worst stories about Hubbard was him putting a child who was not yet 5 years old into the chain locker of his ship. And the chain locker is where the chain is stored when the ship's moving. So it's this filthy, squalid, pitch black hole filled with bilge water, which is like sewer water, with rats in it. And he put a 5-year-old child in there for, I think it was 3 days.
Yeah, I'm
So,
sure the kid's okay. Grew up just fine.
yeah.
No trauma whatsoever.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Speaking of trauma and psychotics or whatever, I've heard tangentially, I'm too lazy to read everything about L. Ron Hubbard, honestly.
Oh, yeah,
But
that's too much of it. But it is fun, a lot of it, be fair.
oh, okay.
A wild
Aleister
story.
Crowley. Aleister Crowley.
Mm.
Was he in first off, was he associated with Aleister Crowley, and was Hubbard associated with any kind of intelligence organizations?
All right. Well, let's start with question number one. Hubbard performed what is called the Babylon working. That's Babylon, Babylon, which was the attempt to bring the Scarlet Woman, the whore of Babylon, as described in the Book of Revelation. He tried to do that with a man called Jack Parsons, who is an incredible character on his own. There's now, I think, a film or a TV series about him called Strange Angel. And he was the guy who developed solid rocket fuel. He's a chemist. And but he also was profoundly involved with Aleister Crowley. And Crowley, there are letters that Crowley wrote where he talks about Hubbard and calls him a con man, basically. And sure enough, a few weeks later, this was in 1946, Hubbard ran off with Parsons' girlfriend, who was also his sister-in-law. These are complicated relationships. Ran off with the girlfriend to Florida, having persuaded Parsons to put his life savings, about $35,000, which in 1946 was a chunk of change, into a joint bank account. And he put everything he had in the world, which was about $200, into it as well. And Parsons sued him down in Florida. The court documents, I've recently found that some of the court documents are no longer in the file. But I got them in the 1980s, so I've got everything there. And Parsons sent out a curse to force him to come back to land. He'd been buying yachts with the money. We don't think Parsons ever got his money back. Hubbard he mentions Parsons in 3 lectures in 1952, and he calls him my very good friend. He mentions Crowley, my very good friend Aleister Crowley. They never met. And he complains about people criticizing Crowley because he was not a Christian and how terrible that was. But in fact, Scientology, there's a guy who wrote a book in which he said, well, it's obvious that a guy called David Barrett, it's obvious that Hubbard was involved with Crowleyite magic, but none of it got into Scientology. Well, I wrote a paper which is on the internet called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, which points to tens of ideas that passed from Crowley to Hubbard, like the idea of the trauma of birth, which Crowley talks about. Hubbard uses the term past lives for reincarnation, as Crowley did. But his procedures, he developed hundreds of different, largely hypnotic processes that get people to derealize, the world around starts melting, or depersonalize. They feel as if they're outside of their bodies. I say it often enough that Hubbard was trying to get you out of your mind, basically, and that's exactly what he said he was doing. And you need to pay close attention to him saying, but their whole idea is to leave your body and go and travel, like the theosophists and people who've been into this kind of stuff for a long time, the astral plane, the etheric, all of this nonsense. He just repackaged all of that and said you'll be able to remotely travel anywhere in the universe you like and make things happen just by pure willpower. As I say, in 40-something years, I've not seen a single instance of any psychic feat, and nobody went and claimed the $1 million from James Randi, of course.
I was going to say neither has James Randi, and neither did Harry Houdini.
Yeah, bless them both. Yeah,
and rest in peace, James Randi. He passed away not that long ago.
That's right. Yes, and absolutely extraordinary man. And there is a wonderful and rambling documentary about him, showing, for example, how there was some psychic testing going on, and the 2 people he trained got to be the 2 people who did the psychic feats. And when it was the day when it was announced that they'd proved all of this, these 2 guys said, no, James Randi trained us, we conned you. And there's this, well, you've wasted our research money. It's like, no, that was money well spent.
There's another group who did that, and it's interesting. I'm not going to go too crazy in it, but James Lindsay and a couple others did that. Helen Pluckrose, I think, did that in the academic community, where they wrote papers that were just asinine, is the best way I could put it. I mean, no, on their face, they're ludicrous, and they worked at it, and they got every citation and wrote it with full academic rigor and got them through. And then people, do they get upset about a system that people can put that through? No, they get upset at the people who create that, who are mocking the system and not taking it seriously. That's a cult in my mind. It's a cultish mentality that you're going against the common views or parameters. And that actually brings me to, I'm going to go back to the intelligence question later for sure. But in your book, I've been reading the Opening Our Minds book on Audible. Everybody's on Audible. So I have to listen to everything. I just don't have any time.
So many people do now. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. What I found striking was you were talking about Omar Khan Sharif and how he was going into, I guess, a strongly fundamentalist Islamic group. And what struck me is you pointed out that he was taught that it's not Muslims and non-Muslims, that it is in fact Muslims and anti-Muslims. Now that started to ring in my head because it's been my criticism about Antifa. Their mentality is you're either a fascist or anti-fascist. And I'm saying I'm neither. I hate you both.
Yes.
And I will go into some of what I feel is coming out of critical race theory. And I'm not going to blame critical race theory directly, but there are people involved in that community who seem to espouse the view of either you are a racist or you're anti-racist.
Yeah. Again,
the same principle. And it's like, no, I'm not racist, period. I'm not anti, I'm not, I just am not. And I wanted to ask you about this because you've done such a wide study of all the different, religions or organizations, because I call MLMs to be very religious in a lot of ways, but they're an organization. Scientology, I think, is so deadly because it kind of crosses the boundaries between religion and MLM. There's like some of this quality, and then all the guru groups, yoga, lifestyle, all of that's going on. What are your thoughts about what I'm saying there about that mindset being taught? Because this is widespread now.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to say, yes, you said it is cultish. And one of the primary aspects of cultish thinking is black and white. And it's long been pointed out that there in fact a spectrum, and that that's true for most things. So what I see, my go-to is the word authoritarian. And so if somebody is saying, look, I'm right and I'm not interested in your point of view, if somebody is bullying you, if somebody expects to be treated as, God on earth, they're an authoritarian. And our society is split between those who believe themselves to be the philosopher kings, or whatever term we go, they should be in charge. And that means Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, Xi, Putin, so many people around the world who really believe that they know better than anybody else. So I didn't mention Donald Trump there. And then you have...
How dare you? Orange Man bad.
I should have mentioned him. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding.
You then have authoritarian leaders of this type, and you then have authoritarian followers. And by most guesses, and lots of people have come to this same number, Schopenhauer was the first I know of, but Milgram, when he did his tests on compliance, found that 62% of people go all the way to total shock just when somebody told them that they ought to do it because it was an experiment. More recently, I think her name is Jane McGregor at Nottingham University here. She has said about 60% of people. Eric Fromm, the great Eric Fromm, about 60% of people.
It's very consistent. Milgram, I think, has been proven out to be one of the strongest psychological experiments, like repeatable, definable. I think they didn't only do it in the lab and at universities, which is always a problem, because I've had a statistician come on and say, yeah, well, you're not finding out about people, you're finding out about grad students who need money for beer. And that's your baseline. But apparently Milgram took his show on the road, and he would just go rent out a room in a hotel and just do that white coat routine over and over. On the flip side, though, Zimbardo is not holding up. There are more and more problems with the Stanford prison experiment coming out, that was almost a directed play and more like reality TV of now. How the producers are telling somebody, it's like, hey, what's going on with you too? And kind of injecting things like that they've come out more and more saying, no, we're kind of told and pushed a little bit to act more guard-like.
Well, I know two specific criticisms with Zimbardo. I know Zimbardo and respect him tremendously for that and many other things, many other experiments that he did. And he is saying, look, I'm not saying I've proved something here. I'm saying, isn't this fascinating? And I think The Lucifer Effect, his book, is a very good justification of what he did. It's also worth saying that all the information we have about that study came from Zimbardo. So he was the gatekeeper who could have stopped it. The two criticisms are, one, there's a tape of one of the assistants actually saying, I think you should, be a bit more pushy. And there's just one instance of that. Zimbardo released that. He made it available.
Which is good. Good.
And the other is the guy who dropped out on the second or third day. And it was said, this is a guy who actually protested the Vietnam War and been arrested and years later, sort of 30 years later, he said, I just wanted to stop doing it. So I told them I was freaking out. Now that doesn't hold up, because the contract that he signed said all he had to do was say, I'd like to leave. So I also have the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, that the further away you are from an event, the less likely. So the documentation at the time says that this guy knew that he could just leave if he wanted to. There may be other criticisms. Those are the only two I've seen. Gina Perry is an Australian professor who's been hostile towards that. We need to review all of these things. Our problem is...
And try to duplicate it. That's part of it too.
We can't repeat them because no ethical committee... Milgram is the point where ethical committees started going, you can't do this to people. Think about the trauma later on. And so we move over to somebody like Derren Brown, a great performer. And because he's not doing experiments, he's been able to substantiate everything that was put forward in those pieces of work, which end pretty much with Stanford in 71, 72, whenever that was. Because no ethical committee will permit it. He, of course, has done 2 Manchurian Candidate demonstrations where you can get somebody to shoot somebody.
Right. And by the way, last night I was with my partner on my other show. I just started a new channel, America's Untold Stories, and we were wrapping up the 3rd part of our RFK assassination series. And Mark Robert, my partner, was actually at the parole hearing speaking on behalf of Sirhan Sirhan. Speaking of claimed or suspected Manchurian candidates, he is, I'd say, possibly the #1 on the list, or extremely high.
The Unabomber as well, definitely went through
MK Ultra,
called a mind control program, and it doesn't seem to have done him much good. One of my good friends is Alan Shefflin, who co-wrote The Mind Manipulators back in '78 about these dreadful programs. And there is no doubt that you can overwhelm a human being into becoming compliant, and the degree of compliance will vary. Looking at studies in Israel that show that, in fact, quite a large amount of the recruits suicide bomber recruits will be people who definably have a dependent personality disorder. Now, you don't find a higher amount in so-called cult groups of this particular personality, but there's a presumption that anybody that joins an authoritarian cult must be dependent. They must be people who want to be told what to do. Well, I think, coming back to our 60%, that 60% of people are looking for somebody else to tell them what to do. And if we're to change society, we have to change it so that 51% of people can make their own minds up. And now,
by the way, that percentage that you just described really lines up well with, I'm going to speak U.S. perspective, but it lines up well with the political parties. You have about 30% who are Republican-ish, or hardcore, like registered, right down the line, and about 30%, shall we say, on the left, Democrat or whatever. And then you have the people in the middle, and it's always a little fight to tug what I like to call the normies, and get them to wake up or pay attention, because it's like scary to consider that if you break them apart, you have the followers, and that's the two spectrums, the ends almost, and then you have the people in the middle who are the majority if you're going to compete against either side. But they don't really want to, it's like they want to avoid everything, and it's an interesting phenomenon. And I feel like we get pulled, and again, I'm speaking from US perspective, I don't know UK law or UK politics that well, but it's a pendulum. It's like you're going this way and then you're going that way, and it makes my head hurt. The Overton window just keeps shifting around.
And everything depends upon the floating voter. The people are committed to, you don't need to appeal to. After the Iraq War, when Tony Blair's government was so unpopular because 80% of the people here said, not in my name, we're not keen on this. And a week before the election, their focus group, which of course is totally upon women aged 35, or thereabouts, who are likely to change their minds. And they found out that one of the things that annoyed them the most was that people would leave their trash bin, their garbage bin, out on the street overnight, and it would get in the pavement and be in the way. And so they brought in a law straight away, immediately, without consultation, that you couldn't put your bin out before 7 in the morning, which for those of us who don't get up quite that early is a bit difficult. And my niece actually works on one of the local councils, and I said, will any council apply this law? And she said no. The law was entirely to get that few percent of voters. And it's become that cynical with all the spin doctors who, of course, are using, it's one of the sets of techniques I get into, because we respond in propaganda, in spin, in cult recruitment, in terrorist recruitment, to exactly the same mechanisms. The way of getting round somebody to get them to do something will be the same. And you have this thing, the kind of invulnerability barrier, that to live in the world, I must be able to trust my perceptions and my interpretation of the world. Therefore, I must be right. Therefore, I know that advertising works on everyone else. It doesn't influence me in any way. And that's how people get recruited, because of that sense of invulnerability. You want to,
and of course it does. So I want to wrap up. We're running hard into the deadline now. Circling back around to my question, was L. Ron Hubbard involved with any intelligence organizations? No.
L. Ron Hubbard was designated as an intelligence officer at the beginning of when the US entered World War II. And that meant that he worked in the office of the cable censor, censoring letters. And he gave talks about recognition of ships and planes. That's what an intelligence officer was. He was never with US Navy intelligence. And indeed, he himself made a statement to that effect, which conspiracy theorists wish to ignore. There's this whole Fletcher Prouty got involved, the infamous Fletcher Prouty, and was paid by Scientology. Say, there was the Navy file you see is sheep dipped. It's not true. His real action. Well, as Russell Miller pointed out, if you're going to sheep dip a file, it would be pretty anodyne. You wouldn't have all of this censure, all of this criticism of the guy if he wasn't actually there and was performing some intelligence work. So it's nonsense. His connection to intelligence was through Robert Heinlein. And I'm told, and I haven't seen it, that Heinlein's journals reveal that not only did Heinlein's wife have sex with Hubbard, but Heinlein himself had sex with Hubbard. So it was pillow talk. It is curious, though, in 1951, Hubbard talks about intelligence operations, that would lead to MK Ultra. So he had some knowledge, but I believe that was from Robert Heinlein.
Wow. Fascinating. Well, this has been amazing. I would love to have you back if we can, and we can talk about a whole recruitment mechanism. I admit I go all over the place in it. That's why I call it unstructured. But this has been amazing, and I hope we can continue the conversation. And everybody watching, be sure to check out my other channel too. Somebody pointed out that I'm getting better at the grift. Yes, hello. It's early on. And check out Jon's channel, of course, which is Jon Atack, Family and Friends.
Yep.
Also on YouTube.
Rush out and buy my book.
Yes, it's on Audible. It's on Audible.
It's on Audible, me droning on for hour after hour.
Well, I think you have a charming voice, but there are impatient people, and I have a friend, Viva Fry. He's a Canadian lawyer. He's a super fast talker, and there are people who listen to him at double speed. So, whatever,
if they need to, But I like the ASMR approach personally.
I have another friend, Emily D. Baker, another lawyer, who did the ASMR of the U.S. Constitution, which I thought was hilarious.
Wonderful. Yeah. We all do that.
On that note, everybody, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. Please, there's a pinned comment. Check out the other channel. I think you'll really enjoy it. And thank you.